Hey, what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Thursday morning, talking 8 games around the NBA. Even though it is opening day for Major League Baseball, we do have all the games except for the one Boston and Mariners game in the afternoon, which means once all those games lock, there will be a void to fill, and you can fill that void with some awesome NBA. If you're not already signed up for my daily projections content and all that good stuff for Major League Baseball, make sure you're sending me a direct message on Twitter. My Twitter handle at BrentonHyden1 is in the description down below, or shooting me a message in Discord. If you're currently subscribed to my NBA content and projections, you get a discount on the MLB package, and if you are not signed up for my NBA content and projections, you do get MLB for full price, but you get NBA free for the rest of the season plus playoffs. So just a little bit of a bonus there for you. But gonna just hop right into the games. Try to knock this out pretty quickly because there is a lot of baseball going on today. Orlando at Detroit, the first game of the day. Detroit 3.5-point favorites in this one, a 206.5 over under. There are some playoff implications in this game. Both these teams fighting for positioning, so that's gonna make it a little bit interesting from a minutes perspective. You're not gonna get a bunch of G League players like the guys the Bulls are running out there getting minutes, but two really solid defenses. Really tough to find a whole lot to really like about this game. That being said, there are a couple options on the Orlando side that I think are interesting. Detroit, really, like I said, decent defense, but they do struggle to defend point guards. They're 19th in defensive efficiency to the position. They've allowed 66.5% shooting at the rim, and they've allowed 40% three-point shooting over the last 30 days. That makes DJ Augustin a guy that I do have a little bit of interest here, just as a cash game mid-range point guard option. He's 5,200 on DraftKings, 5,900 over on FanDuel. We have seen Detroit struggle in isolation against the pick and roll as well. That's a pretty big boost for DJ Augustin, who has been playing really well. He does have over 30 fantasy points in like 6 of his last 10 games. 6 of his last 20 games. That's a little bit interesting. It is a pretty good spot for him. It's a decent spot for Terrence Ross as well. 4,800 is really cheap for a guy that has a bunch of upside. 5K over on FanDuel. Has not been great. Recently did have a good game against Memphis, but he's just out there chucking, taking a lot of shots, double-digit three-pointers in 3 of the last 4, and against a Pistons team that has struggled against shooting guards and also to defend the three-point line. That is interesting here today. There are some reasons to like Evan Fournier, Aaron Gordon, Vucevic. The matchups for them are decent if you look at some of the play type data. Make sure you're checking the notes out for that. The one guy that I do want to hit on the Detroit side before moving on to another game is Blake Griffin, who has been playing a little bit better recently. Coming in, he's 7,900 on DraftKings, 8,800 on FanDuel. Matchup, again, not great. Orlando, a pretty strong defense, but they have really struggled to defend in isolation and against post-ups. If you look at it, they're giving up 0.94 points per possession in isolation. It makes them like the 3rd worst defense in the NBA, and they're also giving up 0.99 points per possession on post-ups, and that's a huge boost to Griffin. 13.3% of his possessions are in isolation. 27% of his possessions come as post-ups. Interesting spot here for Blake Griffin, who is just a little bit too cheap for the upside that he normally has. 7,900 for Griffin, a guy that's been over 40 fantasy points in 4 straight games. Again, playing a little bit better. Usage rate is still there for him, so definitely someone that we want to look at here today. Looking at Brooklyn, Philly. Brooklyn, 7.5-point underdogs in this one, 227.5 over under. We know that Alan Crabb is out. Jonathan Simmons is probable. Mike Scott and James Ennis are questionable. On the Brooklyn side of things, D'Angelo Russell, price is starting to climb back up to 8,700 on DraftKings, 9,500 over on FanDuel. For good reason, though. He's been playing just insanely good basketball, over 50 fantasy points in 4 straight games. This is a spot against a Philly team that he's had success against. He's very interesting. Russell, 35.5% usage rate, 1.41 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. He's seen 30-plus minutes in 4 straight outings. Some of those outings, he's had over 30 minutes at the same time as Spencer Dinwiddie. He takes 25% of his shots in the paint, operates out of the pick and roll on 49.1% of his possessions. That is a boost for Russell because the Sixers 0.89 points per possession allowed to the pick and roll ball handler. They are giving up 50.8 points in the paint. They also do struggle to defend in transition, which is a pretty big boost to D'Angelo Russell as well. I did hit on Spencer Dinwiddie, Jarrett Allen, DeMar Carroll, Rodions Korix, who is a pretty strong value, especially on FanDuel at 3,900, where you can drop his score. Most nights he's going to be a guy 24, 25 minutes. It is a little concerning that, only got 19 against Portland, but it does look like he's playing himself back into the rotation and in a spot against a Philly team that does struggle in the paint and also against power forwards. He's definitely interesting here tonight. On the Philly side, really tough to get away from Joel Embiid, who should just feast here. We know centers against Brooklyn, it's the thing. It's the thing that you do. Joel Embiid coming in on the season, 33.1% usage rate, just 10.4K over on DraftKings, 11.4K over on FanDuel. Did struggle against Orlando. Good game against Atlanta. Just monster upside in a matchup against a Sixers team that just doesn't have anybody that can deal with his size and positioning down low. Brooklyn 25th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers this season. They've given up 14.6 second chance points, 51.2 points in the paint, 46.4 rebounds per game to opposing centers. He is obviously one of the top plays on the entire slate. No real reason to get away from him here against Brooklyn. Jimmy Butler is very interesting. As I noted a few games ago, he's getting a lot of minutes, kind of being the guy on the second unit. And at 7,300, that's really, really intriguing. He's 8,500 over on FanDuel, a little less appealing there. But again, playing more minutes without Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid on the floor, that leads to some extra usage for him. And this is a spot where Brooklyn, a team that really struggles to defend in the paint and mid-range, are allowing 44% field goal percentage in the paint, 42.5% shooting in the mid-range. Butler, who takes 37% of his shots in those zones, is very, very interesting as just a mid-range option. I do like the fact that Brett Brown is rolling him out there without Embiid and Simmons on the floor a little bit more. Taking a look at the Dallas-Miami game, gonna gloss over the Miami side because the injuries to Richardson and Justice Winslow make it really tough to break this down ahead of time because, just don't know which one of those guys is gonna play if either of them plays. I will say, the one guy that I do have my eye on the most is Bam Adebayo, 5,800 on DraftKings, 7,100 on FanDuel, a lot less appealing over there, but that DraftKings price for a guy that is power forward and center eligible is really interesting. He is, starting at center. We have seen Dallas really, really struggle to defend the rim. They're giving up 66.1% field goal percentage at the rim. Bam Adebayo has averaged 1.14 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days, has topped 30 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4, 7 of his last 10. Dallas 15th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers. This is a spot where I do really think Bam Adebayo could have some success. Derek Jones, especially on FanDuel, where you can drop his score at 3,800, is an intriguing small forward option here tonight because he does attack the rim a lot, and that's a spot where Dallas is really weak. Speaking of Dallas, Luka Doncic coming in off another monster triple-double. Really not a great spot for him against Miami. They do defend point guards, wings really, really well. They are a decent defense. That being said, you do have a little bit of a narrative. It is a Slovenian Heritage Night. There's going to be like 1,100 Slovenians at the game cheering on Luka Doncic. He does have a 36% usage rate, 1.50 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Miami, again, pretty decent against opposing point guards, second in defensive efficiency, but it's really tough to ignore the usage and production out of Luka Doncic, who is just 8,400 over on DraftKings, 9,800 over on FanDuel. 60 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games, triple-double upside, back-to-back triple-doubles. It's a spot where Luka has had success in this matchup before. He's definitely someone that we should be looking at here tonight. Maxi Kleber, guy 5,100 over on DraftKings, 5K over on FanDuel, is intriguing as well, given the matchup for him. Backup playing a decent amount of minutes here. We have seen Miami really struggled to defend power forwards. They've allowed them to shoot 38% from three. That's where 53% of his shots come from. He's topped 20 fantasy points in 8 of the last 10 games. That gives him a pretty solid floor. I don't see a ton of upside at that price tag, but in cash games, he is pretty appealing here tonight. Looking at Toronto and the New York Knicks, Kawhi Leonard going to sit this one out. Toronto still favored by like 400 points. Knicks basically rolling out a G League squad at this point. But, 12-point favorites for Toronto, 217.5 over-under again. Kawhi Leonard out. Dennis Smith Jr. Doubtful. Ntilikina, Von Trier out. And Kevin Knox questionable for this game. Because we already know the deal with Toronto. When Kawhi Leonard sits, you play Kyle Lowry, you play Fred VanVleet, you play Pascal Siakam. I know there's blowout risk, but you just got to put that behind you because those three guys are probably going to be the reason why there's blowout risk unless you get Marc Gasol just dropping like 40 real points, which probably isn't going to happen here. Fred VanVleet, 1.02 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days without Kawhi Leonard on the floor. He is going to share a lot of minutes with Kyle Lowry. That does hurt his upside a little bit, but at 4,800 on DraftKings, 5,400 on FanDuel, still a really strong option. Kyle Lowry is cheap, 6,800 across the industry, 27% usage rate, 1.33 fantasy points per minute whenever you take Kawhi Leonard off the floor. Should be able to put up a pretty solid game even if he plays limited minutes here. So he's definitely solid. This Knicks game, this 318 Knicks game, that one was with Kawhi Leonard out. He played 26 minutes and put up 36 fantasy points. So Fred VanVleet had a good game there as well. Trying to pull that one up. He 28 minutes, almost 40 fantasy points. I believe Pascal Siakam had a big game there as well. He's a guy who does generally average a significantly more 38.5 fantasy points. If you look at it, 37.2 DraftKings points per game this season without Kawhi Leonard on the floor. So yeah, he does do a little bit of the ball handling for the second unit. 29th ranked defense against power forwards is what New York is. Yeah, you're just building around those three guys. You can look at Gasol, Ibaka as options. That's fine. The fact that they're splitting minutes at center does kind of hurt them, but both do have upside in this matchup. They would just be MME type plays for me. Danny Green, interesting here as well. He's still pretty cheap across the industry, 4,600 on DraftKings, 3,900 on FanDuel. A pretty strong drop score option. If you want my thoughts on the two Knicks options that are in play, you can check out the notes for that. Denver at Houston, the next game of the night. Should be a pretty fun game to watch. Might not have as much fantasy appeal as we would hope, but a 218 over-under. Houston 5-point favorites in this one. I do want to talk about Nikola Jokic and the matchup for him because it is actually pretty good. Jokic has been up and down recently. He has topped 50 fantasy points in 4 of his last 10 games, has posted a 25% usage rate. He's touching the ball 88.2 times per game. That's still a lot of touches, and he's under 10K over on DraftKings. He's 10.5 over on FanDuel. Houston, 67% shooting allowed at the rim, 51.8 points in the paint allowed. Jokic leads the team with 12 points in the paint per game. 42% of his shots come against the rim. And Jokic operating as the roll man in the pick and roll on 14% of his possessions, going up against one of the league's worst pick and roll defenses. This is an interesting spot for Jokic. I did highlight a couple other options. Will Barton, Gary Harris. I think Gary Harris is really, really intriguing here. Houston 14th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards on the season, but they've really struggled to defend the position over the last 30 days where they've allowed 42% shooting. Gary Harris, who is just 4,200 on DraftKings, 4,500 over on FanDuel. He's small forward eligible on FanDuel, which does actually help him a little bit here because small forward is generally pretty bad. He's going to play as many minutes as he can handle as long as Denver stays in this game because they're going to need him trying to defend James Harden and Chris Paul. He's probably one of the best ways to get exposure to the Denver side of this game. Houston side, obviously James Harden, Chris Paul, fantastic options here. Matchup is actually pretty good for them. As I did note in the breakdown, Denver really bad against isolation players, 0.93 points per possession allowed in isolation. James Harden, coming in with like a 42% usage rate over the last 30 days, operates in isolation on 49% of his possessions and averages a league high 18.1 points per game. Like second in the league is like 8 points per game in isolation. So James Harden, obviously a very, very good option here. With Embiid and Jokic being pricier options, it's going to be hard to get to Harden, I think, but definitely no issue going there. Chris Paul is interesting as well. 30% of his possessions come in isolation. But the dude that I'm actually looking at, I think the most, is going to be Eric Gordon. Once again, 5K on DraftKings, 4,800 on FanDuel. He's never a sexy pick, but has top 20 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10 games. Denver, 22nd in defensive efficiency to opposing small forwards on the season. I think Eric Gordon could be the value option from this game. If you're looking to get cheap exposure, you can get like Eric Gordon and Gary Harris as 2 cheaper ways to get exposure, and then you can get some of the more appealing options on the slate. One of those options from this Clippers-Milwaukee game, Giannis Antetokounmpo, 11-2 over on DraftKings. Again, small forward eligible over on FanDuel, where small forward is always terrible. He's 12-4 over there. Landry Shamet, Patrick Beverly, questionable for this game. Milwaukee 8.5-point favorites, 232.5 over under. I did highlight Eric Bledsoe, Brook Lopez, Pat Connaughton as options from this game in the notes, so make sure you're checking that out. But with Giannis, it just comes down to 33% usage rate, 1.76 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. But if you take Malcolm Brogdon off the floor, 36.1% usage, 1.90 fantasy points per minute. You put him in a matchup against a Clippers team that cannot rebound, cannot defend power forwards, and, well, you get a recipe for a lot of success from Giannis. So very, very high upside option here. Giannis leads the team, 18 rebound chances per game over the last 30 days against the Clippers team that has given up 46 rebounds per game. Pretty good matchup for Giannis. Again, really, really good spot for Eric Bledsoe, who's 7,100 on DraftKings, 7,700 on FanDuel. Clippers, really bad against point guards, really bad defending the pick and roll. It's a spot where he could have a lot of success. Brook Lopez at an elevated price tag, more of a cash game option, but he could have some success in this matchup, so make sure you're digging into the notes for that. Check out the notes for my Clippers thoughts. There's not a whole lot that I like from a matchup perspective in that game. There are a couple of games here, Sacramento, New Orleans, that have some interesting things to talk about here. Sacramento, 3-point favorites in this game at 239 over under. High scoring game here. Frank Jackson is out. Etuan Moore, Jrue Holiday out. Harry Giles still questionable for this game. Buddy Hield, revenge game, and against a Pelicans team giving up 36% 3-point shooting and the league's like 4th worst defense against spot-up shooters, giving up 1.07 points per possession to spot-up shooters. Buddy Hield, who has posted a 26% usage rate over the last 30 days. Yeah, very interesting here. He has really struggled with his shot recently. 10 of 34 shooting over the past 2 games, has not been putting up monster numbers recently, but at 7,100 on DraftKings, 7,400 on FanDuel against a Pelicans team that plays fast, can't defend in the paint, can't defend the 3-point line. Buddy Hield, very, very interesting here. De'Aaron Fox in a really, really good spot as well, coming off 23 points against the Mavericks. Pelicans 27th in defensive efficiency to point guards. Sacramento is chasing a playoff spot. They're technically eliminated, but they still think they have a shot. 24% usage rate for Fox. Minutes should be there. He's averaging 1.16 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. It is a good spot for De'Aaron Fox. It is a great matchup for Marvin Bagley, who is coming off a disappointing outing. Posting up on 25% of his possessions this season. He very inefficient on post-ups, 25th percentile in efficiency, but Pelicans, league's worst defense defending post-up players. They can't defend in the paint. They can't keep opponents off the boards. Bagley, 1.27 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Again, a 26% usage rate. This is a spot where I'm definitely going back to the well with Marvin Bagley after he did struggle against Dallas. I would expect the minutes to get back up to like 30, 31 in this matchup. You can look at CAULEY-STEIN, who is just, I think, a little bit too cheap for the matchup. 5,400 on DraftKings, 6,500 over on FanDuel. Most nights he's going to get you upper 20s in fantasy points. He can produce in bunches, and in a matchup like this, we could see him actually get some decent run here, maybe alongside Bagley a little bit more. But he has topped 25 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10. Pelicans 51.6 points in the paint allowed per game. It is a good spot for Willie Cauley-Stein. Bielitsa will get a minutes boost if Harry Giles gets ruled out. And Harrison Barnes, who's going to continue to play like 35, 36 minutes per night against a Pelicans team that can't defend on the wings, can't defend spot-up shooters. He's very, very interesting as a value here as well. Looking at the Pelicans side, as I mentioned, Frank Jackson is out. It's going to open up minutes for Ian Clark. And while he's never a name that you're looking at a whole heck of a lot, 3,700 for Ian Clark on DraftKings, 4,500 on FanDuel. He does project to be a pretty strong option here. I have him currently projected as one of the best values on the slate at 26 fantasy points on DraftKings. He did play a decent amount of minutes last game, got in foul trouble, but still played 25 minutes, had 5 fouls in 25 minutes. He does tend to get in foul trouble a little bit, and that's always concerning. But it's the Kings. They cannot defend shooting guards. He's probably going to start alongside Elfrid Payton. Really tough to get away from him in this spot. Elfrid Payton is perfectly fine. I do expect his minutes to climb back up, especially with no Frank Jackson. They don't have a whole lot else that they can roll out there behind him. He's 7,700 on DraftKings, 7,500 on FanDuel. Pretty good matchup for him. 40% assist rate over the last 30 days without Holiday and Moore on the floor, 1.15 fantasy points per minute. Darius Miller in line for some extra minutes as well. He's another value, probably better suited for FanDuel than DraftKings. Darius Bertans, someone else that could get in the lineup here. There's just a lot of guys that could actually get some extra minutes because Frank Jackson is out. I would definitely consider taking some shots on them over on FanDuel. Anthony Davis, Julius Randle, Christian Wood, going to be a popular option, I think. 4,100 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. Still projects to be a pretty strong value in this spot. Should still get a decent amount of minutes because it appears they're just not going to give Cheikh Diallo and Jahlil Okafor any minutes. So he's a value guy to keep an eye on. I do apologize for missing out on the Christian Wood victory lap touting the other day. But on to Cleveland, San Antonio, the last game of the night. Collin Sexton, the guy that I really wanted to talk about from the Cleveland side of things. Yeah, it's one of those slates. Collin Sexton, 5,900 on DraftKings, 6,300 on FanDuel. He's been playing really well. Over 20 points in 9 of his last 10 games. 0.90 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days, 26% usage rate. The Spurs, 23rd in defensive efficiency to point guards. They also really struggle to defend in the paint and the mid-range. They're giving up 42% shooting in the paint, 43% shooting in the mid-range. That's where Collin Sexton takes the majority of his shots. 47% of his shots come there. So Collin Sexton, a guy that's been playing really well. Minutes are definitely there for him. Field goal attempts are going to be there for him. He's not going to get you a whole lot in the way of like assists and rebounds and steals. So he's probably better suited for like cash games where that 24, 25, 30 fantasy points is going to pay off. If you're looking in tournaments and you're wanting to get a little bit, get away from Collin Sexton with the cheaper option, Jordan Clarkson's minutes have been up as well. With basically 30 minutes in 4 straight games. He's, the high usage guy off the bench playing really, really well here. He'd be the tournament pivot off of Collin Sexton. Kevin Love in a pretty good spot here as well, is coming off a little bit of a down game. Has not been playing great. Did have that, 50-plus point outing against Milwaukee. But he's still posting a 26% usage rate, 1.29 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. The Spurs have allowed opposing power forwards to shoot 48% from the floor. Love taking 65% of his shots from the paint, mid-range, or above the break threes. Those are areas where San Antonio has struggled to defend this season. So Kevin Love, someone that we should definitely be considering here. And then Larry Nance, 5,400 over on DraftKings, 6,900. Very nice over on FanDuel. 30-plus fantasy points in 3 of the last 4. minutes back up, should be able to put up a solid outing in this spot. I wouldn't completely overlook guys like Brandon Knight, Chetty Osman for large field tournaments, but I think there's better places to look than those guys. For the Spurs, you're basically looking at LaMarcus Aldridge, DeMar DeRozan, Derek White. DeRozan, 27% usage rate, averaging 1.20 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Cavaliers 26th in defensive efficiency to opposing small forwards on the season. And DeRozan is just, I think, a little bit too cheap for the matchup. Obviously, there is blowout risk because, well, it's the Cavaliers. But DeRozan, who is a guy that just lives and dies in the mid-range, going up against a team that cannot defend in the paint or mid-range or at the rim, yeah, this is a pretty good spot for DeMar DeRozan. So he's the guy I'm looking at most. You can still look at LaMarcus Aldridge, Derek White, who has struggled recently, but averaging 1.03 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Cavaliers can't defend the paint or the rim or the three-point line, so that's a pretty big boost for White, who is just 5,200 over on DraftKings, 6,500 over on FanDuel. But that's going to do it. That is the quick slate overview for NBA. Make sure you're checking that out. Make sure you're checking out the notes. Make sure you're hitting me up if you're not already subscribed for NBA. I will be back tomorrow for both MLB and NBA.